Energy Media readers, we've got a really interesting interview this afternoon because we're going to be talking to Marla Orenstein from the Canada West Foundation and her colleague Patrick Smith. And they have written a very, very interesting briefing memo called What Now? And it looks at energy use and global emissions and where are we going post-COVID, post-pandemic. And they've come up with some, I think, actually quite startling conclusions. So welcome to the interview, Marla and Patrick.
Thanks, Markham.
Thanks for having us.
Now let's start out, if one of you could give us an overview of the briefing memo, please.
Sure, I'll start there. What we did is we took a look at some figures that recently came out from the International Energy Agency. And they were looking at the question of, given the COVID lockdowns, everything that's been happening that everybody's really familiar with, air travel has disappeared, road travel has disappeared, everybody's staying home, most businesses are closed. What did this do to energy use, and what did this do to greenhouse gas emissions? And so the first thing that we did is we took a look to see what it is that they said and what they found, and then we tried to figure out what the implications were for what this means for our own energy transition and our ability to meet the Paris goals.
So one of the controversial conclusions that you came to is that we are not likely to meet our Paris Agreement targets.
Yep. The problem that we've seen is that even during this lockdown, with pretty much nobody traveling or going anyplace, and a lot of the adverse effects that really nobody wants, no social contact, no going out. What we found is that in the places that had a full lockdown, energy use decreased by 25%. In places that had a partial lockdown, it was 18%. And when you averaged it over the course of the first quarter, which is before the height of it, it was about 4% in terms of decrease of energy use and a 5% decrease in GHG emissions. And the IEA projected that by the end of the year, it would reach about 8% overall in terms of GHG emissions decrease. The problem is that if we were to keep to a 2-degree scenario or a 1.5 degree scenario, we need to get back, we need basically a 25% decrease across the entire world or a 55% decrease in order to reach the 1.5 degree scenario by 2030. So in other words, we need to have energy use that's equivalent to the full lockdown in the places that were most fully locked down. And in addition to that, by 2030, we're projected to have an energy demand increase of 50% at the same time because of more population, economic growth. So we're looking at trying to get down to these lockdown levels while there's this 50% demand increase. And it's very hard to reconcile the two. It's not that it's not a good or appropriate thing to want to reduce emissions, but the realistic question of can we, how do we, it makes it quite tough.
Let's talk about how we might, the things that you would recommend that we need to do fairly soon. It includes using more natural gas. It includes considering nuclear power and considering the true potential of renewables. So let's start with natural gas. Why do you think we need more natural gas?
And Patrick, feel free to jump in here.
Yeah.
The biggest GHG emitter is coal. The quicker we get off coal, the quicker we bring down greenhouse gas emissions globally in a really meaningful way. Natural gas is a really good transition fuel. It has a much, much lower GHG profile than coal and can be swapped out relatively quickly. So for these reasons, for example, last year alone in the United States, that switching of coal to natural gas decreased GHG emissions overall from the country by 3% in just that year. Renewables just are not being built at the rate that can supply the same sources and do so at the same rate. So it is a transition fuel, but it's something that has the potential to leap in very quickly to help get away from coal.
Yeah, if there's anything I can add to that, it's just the thrust of the brief is trying to paint a picture of exactly how dire our circumstance is. We mentioned that half of the world's population and 60% of the world's GDP has been under partial or full lockdown. And in the context of global carbon emissions and greenhouse gases, we are still so far away. And so in regards to natural gas as a transition fuel, renewables and nuclear, which we mentioned as well, it's really an all hands on deck approach. I think the angle that we're trying to approach it from is there's no one silver bullet means of really addressing what has become a really exacerbated issue if we do want to meet our climate goals by 2030.
So if we're going to use more natural gas, last year the Canadian Energy Research Institute put out a study about methane emission leaks in the natural gas supply chain in Western Canada. And it found that BC gas is not very leaky at all. Alberta gas the gas system is quite leaky. Saskatchewan is horribly leaky. They just did a study it was a satellite imagery study, not imagery, but the methane emission measurement by using satellite down in the Permian Basin in West Texas, and found way higher leakage rates than they had anticipated. So if 3% leakage is the threshold between natural gas and coal, or gas is better than coal, I'm not sure that switching to more natural gas will make a difference.
I think one of the things that you're highlighting there, Markham, is a really important point, that there, again, as Patrick said, there's no silver bullet here. Every single type of energy source that you can think of comes with positive benefits, and it also comes with adverse effects. And this is true whether you're talking about solar, whether you're talking about wind, whether you're talking about biomass, whether you're talking about natural gas, nuclear, etc. They've all got advantages and disadvantages. Nuclear has the problems that we know about in terms of waste, in terms of potential proliferation, but it's also a really intensive energy source. It's reliable, it doesn't have intermittency problems, and it has a nice tiny land footprint. Wind is great and it's free, but it has a huge land take sometimes and interferes with land use and biodiversity. Biomass can be great if what you're using is for a fuel source is what's out of your green bins, but if you're cutting down forests, not so great. So all of these things, I think there's when you start poking at them, there's better angles and there's worse angles. There's things that you want to try to use. They're the lowest hanging fruit, and then there's other parts that are more problematic. But we don't get away from the problems with any energy source. When we use energy, we're creating a problem. Fundamentally, that's what it comes down to, and we're going to have to make choices, and there's no easy choices.
Okay, so I actually agree with your argument, even though I was playing the devil's advocate there for a moment. But so we have to have all of the above energy plan, and when we do use hydrocarbons, for instance, they need to be decarbonized as much as possible. Mm-hmm. Maybe we need some, carbon capture and sequestration. I mean, there's all sorts of tools we have.
Sure,
the problem is
hydrogen and get rid of that problem.
Yes, exactly right. The problem is we're not doing it fast enough. And I, in a recent column for Hydrocarbon Vision, I said, we need to take a moonshot approach to this, the way JFK did in 1961, when he said he'd put America would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and they did it in 69. It seems like we need to do the same thing. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, 100%.
How do we do that?
I think it's kind of like what we mentioned in the paper. It's really a whole of energy approach, if you will, whether that's LNG, nuclear, renewable, a combination of all of them. Because you mentioned it, timing is really key in this instance where, spending time trying to tweak different energy sources or make sure that emissions reductions are exactly what they need to be is part of it, but fundamentally mitigation has to be central. And so timing and all sorts of energy sources need to be part of the mix. Now,
the Canada West Foundation is headquartered in Calgary, and so I cover the Calgary energy news a lot, and I can say with, I think, some certainty that this strategy will probably not be well received by folks who are, say, managing oil sands companies.
I'm not sure I would agree with you there. I've been speaking with those very folks. For example, our previous CEO, Martha Hall Finley, who left us at the end of December, is now the VP of Sustainability at Suncor, where she went into that role because she actually felt that she had an opportunity to make a meaningful difference, not just for Suncor and not just for the oil sands more broadly, but really for the energy picture across the globe. I've come to a lot of people who have very enlightened thinking with respect to the oil sands. They want to be doing it better. They want to be part of the solution. again, it's not an easy solution, and it's not a pure solution. It's not something that is going to be without adverse consequences, but again, nothing is. So I think there's certainly a lot of people who are maybe backwards looking or knuckle draggers that exist, not just in Alberta, but elsewhere as well. There's some pie in the sky idealists who have some great ideas that can never be realized. But I think there's a lot of people in Alberta as well as elsewhere who are doing their damnedest right now to make meaningful change.
Well, let's address that. I mean, I wrote a book last year called The New Alberta Advantage, Technology, Policy, and the Future of the Oil Sands, in which I argued that the oil sands companies were visionaries, that they were committed to lowering their GHGs and so on. And then, of course, until they weren't. And what we're seeing now, for instance, is, Cenovus, I'll pick on them because they're in the news lately, but, they're saying, well, we'll lower our GHG emissions intensity, but we're going to keep emissions flat during the 2020s. And maybe we'll get to net zero by 2050. That's hardly a moonshot. No, so how do you persuade Alex Pourbet at Cenovus that he needs to accelerate that significantly and maybe get to net zero by 2030, which is a moonshot?
Yeah, I don't think that you can have a moonshot where you just point at any one astronaut and tell them they're responsible for doing it. A moonshot is something that really has to bring in absolutely all players on all levels, within oil sands industry, within government, within the clean tech sector, within finance, within a lot of other sectors working together. If you're just going to look at any one company and say it's on you to get there, it's going to be very difficult for them to see how they do it. There's more and more of these companies that are making net zero pledges. Cenovus is certainly one, but they're not the only one. There's regional governments that are doing the same. And so there's got to be some sort of concerted working to get there, or nobody's going to be able to get there, and it will become a meaningless pledge from everyone.
Well, now in my defense, I just used Cenovus as an example, so I wasn't suggesting they should do it all themselves. But nevertheless, now you're getting to the nub of my argument here, which is that if we have to do this, everybody has to get on the bandwagon. We all have to sing Kumbaya and hold hands and do this together. Perfectly, I agree with you 100%, and I don't see the leadership in Alberta. I don't see it nationally in Canada, and frankly, in plenty of the countries around the world, like our neighbors down south. I don't see it either. So where is the leadership going to come from to get this organized and so that we can have a moonshot?
I don't know where the leadership is going to come from exactly, and it's an issue that we're continuing to try to pick away at from the Canada West Foundation in terms of trying to figure out how do you put together this system that is going to enable a moonshot to happen. I have sympathy for the pragmatists who say it's not possible because of the United States, because China, because of all these other different reasons. I understand that those exist as true impediments, but nonetheless, it isn't something that should be able to stop us from taking meaningful action.
Yeah, and just to add to that briefly, the leadership's going to have to come in the immediate term. One of the graphs that the IEA included, and we included in our brief as well, was how global energy use after each dip almost rose twofold in response. And so not only is leadership going to be necessary, but it's going to have to be in the immediate term.
Okay, fair enough. And I would agree with all of those sentiments, all of those arguments. And I'm just a little skeptical that leadership is emerging from anywhere in the economy, frankly, either from the clean energy side or from the hydrocarbon side. So that is something we can talk about in future interviews. Thank you very much for this, Patrick and Marla, and we'll look forward to chatting with you in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.